And it's recently been reported that Camilla is likely to be a bit nervous about the upcoming coronation and that her ex-husband, Andrew Parker Bowles, will also be there.
For over 3 decades, one man has kept the most explosive royal secret locked away. Andrew Parker Bowles, the decorated cavalry officer who was married to Queen Camilla for 22 years, has watched in silence as the world speculated about his divorce, his wife's affair with Prince Charles, and his role in the most scandalous love triangle in modern royal history. But at 85 years old, Andrew Parker Bowles is finally ready to break his silence. What he reveals will shatter everything you thought you knew about the woman who became queen consort and the marriage that had to end. The shocking confession. The drawing room of Andrew Parker Bowles' countryside estate is lined with military honors, family portraits, and memories of a life lived in service to the crown and country. But today, the 85-year-old retired brigadier sits not as a decorated officer, but as a man unburdening himself of a secret that has weighed on him for over 30 years. His hands, weathered by age but steady with resolve, clasp together as he begins to speak about the most painful chapter of his life. Andrew Parker Bowles has finally decided to tell the truth about why he divorced Camilla Shand, the woman who would later become Queen Consort of England. The revelation he's about to share contradicts decades of carefully crafted public narratives and will fundamentally change how the world views one of the most controversial figures in royal history. This isn't the story of a cuckolded husband graciously stepping aside for a prince. This isn't the tale of a marriage that simply grew apart under the pressure of royal interference. What Andrew Parker Bowles reveals is far more complex, far more painful, and far more shocking than anything the press or public ever imagined. He speaks of betrayals that went beyond adultery, of manipulations that reached the highest levels of the palace, and of a moment when he realized that the woman he loved had become someone he no longer recognized. For decades, Andrew has been portrayed as either a naive husband blind to his wife's affair or a calculating opportunist who benefited from royal connections. Both characterizations, he insists, are wrong. The truth, as Andrew tells it, involves a web of deception that began long before Charles and Camilla's romance became public knowledge. It involves conversations behind closed doors, pressure from sources he never expected, and a realization that his marriage had become a casualty in a much larger game of royal chess. Andrew's voice carries the weight of years of silence as he explains why he's chosen to speak now. It's not revenge, he insists, nor is it bitterness toward the woman who is now queen. Instead, an elderly man desires to set the record straight before it's too late. His children deserve to know the whole truth. History deserves to know what really happened. And perhaps most importantly, Andrew Parker Bowles deserves to have his own voice heard in a story where he's been relegated to the role of silent bystander. As he begins to unfold his account of those tumultuous years, it becomes clear that the divorce of Andrew Parker Bowles and Camilla Shand was not just the end of a marriage, but the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan that had been years in the making. The question that haunts him still is whether he was ever truly a husband, or simply a placeholder, until the real leading man could take his rightful place on the stage. The cavalry officer and the debutante. London in the late 1960s was a city transformed by youth, rebellion, and possibility. Against this backdrop of cultural revolution, two young people from quintessentially English backgrounds found each other at a debutante ball that would change both their lives forever. Andrew Parker Bowles, then a dashing young officer in the Blues and Royals, cut an impressive figure in his military dress uniform. At 23, he embodied everything that post-war Britain admired: decorated military service, impeccable breeding, and the kind of understated confidence that came from generations of service to crown and country. Camilla Shand, just 20 years old, was considered one of the most eligible young women of her generation. Beautiful, witty, and from a well-connected family, she moved through London's social circles with an ease that belied her years. Their first meeting was, by all accounts, electric. Andrew remembers being immediately struck not just by Camilla's beauty, but by her intelligence and her irreverent sense of humor that could reduce a room to laughter. She was unlike the other debutantes of their circle, unafraid to speak her mind and possessed of a magnetic personality that drew people to her like moths to flame. Their courtship unfolded against the glamorous backdrop of 1960s high society. There were hunt balls in the countryside, polo matches at Windsor, and intimate dinners in London's most exclusive restaurants. Andrew was completely captivated by this remarkable young woman who seemed to understand him in ways no one else ever had. She listened to his military stories with genuine interest, shared his love of horses and country life, and possessed an earthy sensuality that contrasted beautifully with her aristocratic upbringing. The young couple quickly became fixtures on the social scene, photographed at premieres and charity galas, their names linked in the society pages as one of London's most promising young couples. Andrew's military career was flourishing, and Camilla seemed the perfect partner for an ambitious officer destined for great things. Their friends from that era remember a couple genuinely in love, finishing each other's sentences and sharing private jokes that spoke to in deep intimacy. But even in those early golden days, there were signs of the complications that would later tear their world apart. Camilla had always moved in royal circles through family connections, and Andrew noticed how she seemed particularly energized by the proximity to power and privilege that came with the British establishment. She was ambitious in ways that weren't always obvious, possessed of a keen understanding of social hierarchies and how to navigate them to her advantage. Andrew found these qualities attractive initially, seeing them as evidence of his girlfriend's intelligence and social sophistication. What he didn't recognize at the time was how these same qualities would eventually create an unbridgeable chasm between them. The fairy tale romance of the cavalry officer and the debutante was real, Andrew insists, but it was also incomplete. Even as they fell deeper in love, larger forces were already at work that would ultimately determine the trajectory of their relationship. The question that haunts Andrew still is whether their love ever stood a chance against the weight of royal expectation and ambition that would soon engulf them both. The Prince's Shadow. The first time Andrew Parker Bowles heard the name Prince Charles mentioned in connection with his girlfriend, he dismissed it as idle gossip from the kind of people who delighted in creating drama where none existed. It was 1970, and Andrew and Camilla had been together for over 2 years when whispers began circulating through their social circles about the young prince's interest in Miss Shand. Andrew's initial reaction was amusement rather than concern. After all, Charles was barely 22 years old, shy and awkward in social situations, hardly the type to pose a threat to a decorated military officer who had already won Camilla's heart. But as Andrew recalls now, his dismissive attitude began to change as he noticed subtle shifts in Camilla's behavior whenever the prince's name arose in conversation. Her eyes would brighten with an intensity he'd never seen before, and she would pepper him with questions about royal protocol and the inner workings of palace life that seemed oddly specific for casual curiosity. The first meeting between Charles and Camilla came at a polo match, an event Andrew himself had arranged, never imagining he was orchestrating the beginning of the end of his own happiness. He watched from the sidelines as Camilla charmed the prince with her wit and knowledge of horses, noting how Charles seemed to hang on her every word in a way that suggested something far more profound than polite interest. What disturbed Andrew most was not the prince's obvious attraction to his girlfriend, but Camilla's response to it. She seemed to transform in Charles's presence, becoming more animated, more flirtatious, more alive than Andrew had ever seen her. It was as if she had been waiting her entire life for this moment, for the opportunity to captivate someone of such significance. The frequency of Charles's appearances in their social circle began to increase dramatically. Suddenly, the prince was everywhere they went, appearing at parties they attended, joining hunts they participated in, and finding excuses to visit mutual friends whenever Andrew and Camilla were expected to be present. Andrew began to feel like a third wheel in his own relationship, watching helplessly as an invisible bond formed between his girlfriend and the heir to the throne. The conversations between Charles and Camilla grew longer and more intimate, filled with private jokes and shared references that excluded everyone else in the room, including Andrew himself. What made the situation particularly painful was Andrew's growing realization that Camilla was actively encouraging the prince's attention. She would dress more carefully when she knew Charles would be present, laugh more enthusiastically at his jokes, and find ways to sit beside him at dinner parties. Andrew confronted her about it once during a quiet moment at home, asking directly if she had feelings for the prince. Camilla's response was to turn the question back on him, asking why he would be so insecure about a friendship with someone who would clearly never be able to marry someone like her. Her deflection was masterful, making Andrew feel foolish for raising the subject while never actually denying the attraction that was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone around them. As 1970 turned into 1971, Andrew found himself in the surreal position of competing with the future King of England for the affections of the woman he loved, a competition he was destined to lose not because he lacked merit, but because he lacked a crown. Behind palace doors, by 1970, Andrew Parker Bowles had unwittingly become an insider to one of the most carefully orchestrated deceptions in modern royal history. What he witnessed during those years would later make him question everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and the true nature of power within the British establishment. The phone calls began innocuously enough, seemingly innocent conversations between friends that gradually became longer, more frequent, and increasingly secretive. Andrew would return home from military duties to find Camilla hurriedly ending telephone conversations. Her cheeks flushed with excitement she claimed was simply the result of chatting with girlfriends about social plans. But Andrew knew the difference between social gossip and the breathless intensity he observed in Camilla after these mysterious calls. He began to recognize a pattern. The conversations always seemed to occur at specific times, usually when he was expected to be away, and they always left Camilla in a state of elevated mood that lasted for hours. The coded language came next. Andrew noticed that Camilla had developed an elaborate system of euphemisms when discussing specific social engagements. A riding lesson might mean something entirely different from an actual equestrian activity. A charity meeting could be a cover for something far more personal. Weekend visits to help friends with their horses began to coincide suspiciously with periods when Andrew knew the prince had no official engagements scheduled. What disturbed Andrew most was how expertly Camilla managed these deceptions, how naturally the lies flowed from her lips when he asked direct questions about her whereabouts or activities. The realization that he was living with someone capable of such elaborate subterfuge was more painful than the knowledge of the affair itself. Andrew's military training had taught him to observe details, and the details were becoming impossible to ignore. There were unexplained absences that lasted hours longer than stated plans. There were new items of expensive jewelry that Camilla claimed were gifts from female friends. There were sudden changes in weekend plans that always seemed to benefit someone else's schedule. Most tellingly, there were the letters. Andrew discovered them quite by accident while looking for insurance documents in Camilla's desk. Hidden beneath household bills and social correspondence was a collection of letters written in an unmistakable hand, letters that spoke of longing, of shared dreams, and of a future that apparently didn't include the man who was supposed to be Camilla's partner. The content of those letters revealed not just an affair, but a love story that had been unfolding parallel to Andrew's own relationship for months. The most devastating aspect wasn't the evidence of physical betrayal. Still, the emotional intimacy revealed in those pages, an intimacy that Andrew realized had never truly existed in his own relationship with Camilla. He had been in love with a woman who was apparently incapable of the same depth of feeling toward him. Andrew faced an impossible choice: confront Camilla with evidence that would end their relationship immediately, or continue living with the knowledge that he was essentially a cover story for one of the most significant romantic relationships of the century. The weight of this secret began to consume him, affecting his military performance and his relationships with friends who had no idea of the drama unfolding behind the scenes of what appeared to be one of London's most solid young couples. The breaking point. The moment that shattered Andrew Parker Bowles' world came not during a dramatic confrontation or a tearful confession, but during an ordinary Tuesday evening in their London flat in the spring of 1973. Camilla had returned from what she claimed was a shopping expedition with friends, her mood unusually elevated, and her appearance suggesting she had taken particular care with her grooming. Andrew was reading military reports when she sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap in a gesture he had learned to recognize as a prelude to a difficult conversation. What happened next would replay in Andrew's mind for the next 50 years. Camilla looked directly at him with an expression he had never seen before, a mixture of determination and something that might have been pity. She told him, with stunning matter-of-factness, that she was in love with someone else, and that their relationship had reached its natural conclusion. The words were delivered without drama, without tears, without any acknowledgement of the devastation they would cause. Andrew's first reaction was disbelief, not because he hadn't suspected, but because of the clinical manner in which Camilla was dismantling their life together. When he asked who the other man was, Camilla's response was to smile slightly and suggest that he already knew the answer to that question. The confirmation of what he had suspected for months should have been a relief, but instead it felt like a physical blow. What Andrew found most disturbing was not the fact of Camilla's betrayal, but her apparent inability to understand why he might be hurt by it. She spoke as if their relationship had been a pleasant interlude rather than a serious commitment, as if the years they had spent building a life together were merely a temporary arrangement that had now outlived its usefulness. When Andrew asked if there was any possibility of working through their problems, Camilla's response revealed the actual depth of her ambition and the calculated nature of her choices. She told him that some opportunities were too significant to sacrifice for the sake of preserving feelings, and that he should understand, as a military man, the necessity of strategic thinking in matters of the heart. The conversation that followed was perhaps more devastating than the initial revelation. Camilla laid out her vision of their future with business-like precision. They would continue to appear together at social functions until a suitable transition period had elapsed. Andrew would be expected to maintain discretion about the true reasons for their separation. In return, she assured him that their social standing would remain intact and that she would ensure his continued acceptance in the circles that mattered most for his career advancement. What struck Andrew most forcefully was the realization that Camilla had been planning this conversation for months, possibly years. She had anticipated his questions and prepared responses that revealed an understanding of human psychology that was both impressive and terrifying. She knew exactly how to present her betrayal as a mutual decision, how to make him feel like a participant in his own abandonment. The breaking point wasn't the affair itself, Andrew realizes now, but the recognition that he had never truly known the woman he thought he loved. The Camilla sitting across from him that evening was someone entirely different from the person he had believed himself to be in love with for nearly 5 years. Gentleman's agreement or royal manipulation? In the weeks following Camilla's devastating revelation, Andrew Parker Bowles found himself drawn into a web of conversations and meetings that would forever change his understanding of how power operates at the highest levels of British society. The first approach came from an unexpected source, a senior courtier who contacted Andrew through military channels, suggesting they meet for what was described as an informal chat about matters of mutual interest. The meeting took place at a gentleman's club in St. James's, in a private dining room where conversations could be held without fear of interruption or observation. Andrew's initial assumption was that this was some sort of damage control exercise, an attempt to gauge his intentions regarding discretion about the prince's relationship with his girlfriend. What he encountered instead was something far more sophisticated and, in retrospect, more disturbing. The courtier, whose name Andrew still refuses to reveal even after all these years, presented what he called a framework for managing a delicate situation. The language was diplomatic, but the message was unmistakable. Andrew's cooperation in facilitating a smooth transition would be both expected and rewarded. The rewards, as outlined in that oak-paneled room, were substantial and varied. There was the promise of accelerated military promotion, with assurances that his career would benefit from the gratitude of certain influential parties. There were hints about future business opportunities that would become available to someone with his particular combination of military experience and social connections. Most significantly, there was the suggestion that his financial security would be permanently enhanced through various arrangements that could be structured to appear entirely legitimate. Andrew's initial reaction was outrage. The implication that he could be bought off, that his pain and humiliation could be compensated with career advancement and money, struck him as deeply insulting. But as the conversation continued, he began to understand that this wasn't really an offer he could refuse. The courtier made it clear, without ever stating it directly, that Andrew's future prospects depended entirely on his willingness to play the role that had been written for him in this royal drama. The most chilling aspect of the conversation was the courtier's casual reference to other individuals who had found themselves in similar situations over the years. There was a clear implication that Andrew was not the first person to face this particular choice, and that the palace had considerable experience in managing such delicate transitions. The efficiency with which his situation was being handled suggested a well-established protocol for dealing with inconvenient romantic entanglements involving members of the royal family. What disturbed Andrew most was the realization that his relationship with Camilla had apparently been under observation and management from its earliest stages. The courtier's knowledge of intimate details about their relationship, details that could only have come from someone very close to the situation, suggested that Andrew had been living under a level of scrutiny he had never imagined. The question that haunted him was whether Camilla had been reporting on their relationship all along, whether she had been an active participant in this manipulation from the very beginning. By the end of that meeting, Andrew understood that he had a choice between cooperation and destruction. The gentleman's agreement being offered was really no agreement at all, but rather a carefully crafted ultimatum dressed in the language of mutual benefit and civilized behavior, the children caught in between. Perhaps no aspect of the dissolution of Andrew Parker Bowles's marriage caused him more anguish than watching his children navigate the aftermath of a divorce that had become international headlines. Tom and Laura Parker Bowles were just teenagers when their private family crisis exploded into the most scrutinized scandal in modern royal history, and Andrew's protective instincts as a father were constantly at war with his inability to shield them from the relentless media attention that followed their mother's relationship with Prince Charles. The children had grown up in a household where royal connections were simply part of the fabric of their social world. Still, nothing could have prepared them for the intensity of public interest that accompanied the revelation of their mother's affair. Suddenly, Tom and Laura found themselves photographed on their way to school, followed by reporters seeking quotes about their family situation, and subjected to the kind of scrutiny that would have been overwhelming for adults, let alone adolescents trying to make sense of their parents' failed marriage. Andrew watched helplessly as his children were forced to develop coping mechanisms that no child should need. They learned to recognize the telltale signs of photographers hiding in bushes near their school. They developed strategies for avoiding certain public places where journalists might corner them. Most heartbreakingly, they began to withdraw from their father, not out of any lack of love, but because they had learned that being seen with him often intensified media interest in their family's private affairs. The most painful moments came when Andrew realized his children were beginning to blame him for the family's dissolution. The media narrative that emerged painted Camilla as a woman trapped in a loveless marriage who had found true happiness with Prince Charles. At the same time, Andrew was portrayed as either a fool who had failed to recognize his wife's unhappiness, or a calculating opportunist who had benefited from royal connections. His children, consuming this narrative through newspapers and television reports, began to question whether their father had been a good husband, whether he had driven their mother into the arms of another man through his own shortcomings. Andrew's attempts to explain the true dynamics of his marriage were hampered by his commitment to maintaining discretion about the more disturbing aspects of Camilla's behavior and the palace's involvement in orchestrating their separation. He could not tell his children about the manipulation he had endured, the pressure he had faced, or the calculated nature of their mother's betrayal without destroying their relationship with Camilla entirely. This left him in the impossible position of accepting blame for failures that were not entirely his own to preserve his children's ability to maintain a relationship with their mother. The children's relationship with Charles presented its own complications. As their mother's lover became an increasingly prominent figure in their lives, Tom and Laura were forced to navigate the awkward dynamics of having their family's destroyer gradually assume a paternal role in their household. Andrew watched as Charles worked to win over his children, offering them opportunities and experiences that Andrew could never match, slowly but systematically replacing him as the primary male influence in their lives. What Andrew found most difficult to accept was his children's gradual adaptation to their new reality. They learned to compartmentalize their relationships, maintaining affection for their father while receiving the benefits that came with their mother's royal connection. The pragmatic nature of their adjustment reminded Andrew painfully of Camilla's own ability to separate emotion from strategic advantage. Watching from the sidelines. From his position as the discarded husband, Andrew Parker Bowles had a unique vantage point from which to observe one of the most remarkable transformations in modern British history: the evolution of Camilla Shand from his ex-wife into the most controversial woman in Britain and eventually into Queen Consort. What he witnessed during those decades was a masterclass in image rehabilitation and strategic patience that few people were positioned to appreciate as fully as the man who had once been married to the woman at the center of it all. The early years following their divorce were perhaps the most difficult for Andrew to endure. He watched as Camilla and Charles conducted their relationship with increasing openness, attending the same social events, appearing at the same sporting fixtures, and gradually normalizing their presence as a couple in the circles where Andrew had once been welcomed as Camilla's husband. The social awkwardness was excruciating, but what disturbed Andrew more was observing how efficiently Camilla navigated these situations, how skillfully she managed to maintain friendships with people who had been close to Andrew while simultaneously establishing her new position in the social hierarchy. The public revelation of Charles and Camilla's affair during the prince's marriage to Diana created a new level of notoriety that Andrew watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. Suddenly, the woman he had once shared breakfast with was being discussed in Parliament, denounced by religious leaders, and subjected to a level of public hatred that seemed almost medieval in its intensity. Andrew found himself in the surreal position of feeling protective towards someone who had caused him immense pain, recognizing that, whatever Camilla's faults, the level of vitriol directed at her was disproportionate and often misogynistic. What impressed Andrew, despite his personal feelings, was Camilla's resilience during those dark years when she was widely regarded as the most hated woman in Britain. She endured death threats, public humiliation, and social ostracism with a stoicism that reminded him of the qualities that had initially attracted him to her. The woman who had seemed so fragile and dependent during their marriage revealed reserves of strength that surprised even someone who had known her intimately. The gradual rehabilitation of Camilla's public image was something Andrew observed with professional admiration. The strategic deployment of charitable work, the careful cultivation of media relationships, and the patient building of public acceptance through consistent behavior over many years all demonstrated a level of political sophistication that Andrew had never fully appreciated during their marriage. He began to understand that Camilla possessed skills that extended far beyond social charm, that she was capable of executing long-term strategies with remarkable discipline and effectiveness. The most poignant moment for Andrew came during the wedding of Charles and Camilla in 2005. He was not invited, of course, but he watched the ceremony on television with the strange mix of emotions that only an ex-husband could understand. There was satisfaction in seeing Camilla finally achieve the goal she had pursued for over 30 years. Still, there was also a profound sadness in recognizing how completely their shared past had been erased from the narrative of her triumph. When Camilla became Queen Consort following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, Andrew felt a complex mixture of pride and melancholy. The woman who had once been his wife had achieved the highest position available to any woman in British society, but in doing so, she had become someone entirely removed from the person he had once loved. No regrets, only truth. At 85 years old, Andrew Parker Bowles sits in the quiet of his countryside study, surrounded by the accumulated memories of a life that has been both blessed and shadowed by his connection to one of the most significant royal stories of the modern era. The afternoon light streams through windows that have witnessed decades of contemplation about choices made, paths taken, and truths that have remained hidden for far too long. His decision to finally speak publicly about his marriage to Camilla and the circumstances of their divorce has not been made lightly or in haste, but represents the culmination of years of reflection about legacy, truth, and the responsibility he feels to history and his own family. Andrew insists that his motivation is not revenge against the woman who is now Queen Consort, nor is it an attempt to diminish her achievements or challenge her position. Instead, he describes it as the natural desire of an elderly man to ensure that his own story is told accurately before it becomes impossible to correct the historical record. Too many accounts of the Charles and Camilla romance have reduced him to a footnote, a convenient obstacle that was easily overcome on the path to true love. The reality, as Andrew experienced it, was far more complex and far more painful than these simplified narratives suggest. What Andrew wants the world to understand is that his marriage to Camilla was not a convenience or a placeholder, but a genuine relationship built on real affection and shared experiences. The betrayal he experienced was not just the discovery of an affair, but the realization that the woman he had loved had been systematically deceiving him while planning his removal from her life with calculating precision. The involvement of palace officials in orchestrating his cooperation in the divorce was not the gallant assistance of well-meaning courtiers, but a sophisticated manipulation that left him with no real choice about his own future. The children he raised were not just innocent bystanders to their parents' marital problems, but casualties of a situation that forced them to choose between their father and the advantages that came with their mother's royal connections. Andrew acknowledges that some people will view his decision to speak publicly as the bitter complaints of a man who cannot accept that his ex-wife found greater happiness with someone else. He understands that his version of events will be challenged, that there will be those who question his motives and dispute his recollections. But he also believes that truth has its own power and that his perspective deserves to be part of the historical record, regardless of how uncomfortable it might make certain parties. Looking back over the decades since his divorce, Andrew expresses genuine admiration for what Camilla accomplished in transforming herself from one of the most reviled women in Britain into a respected queen consort. He recognizes the strength, intelligence, and determination required to achieve such a remarkable rehabilitation. But he also maintains that acknowledging her success does not require erasing the cost of her choices or ignoring the collateral damage caused by her ambitions. At 85, Andrew Parker Bowles has reached the age where truth matters more than diplomacy, where legacy becomes more important than keeping secrets. His final words on the subject are delivered with the quiet authority of someone who has carried a burden for too long and is finally ready to set it down. Andrew Parker Bowles closes his leather-bound photo album, filled with images of a life that intersected with history in ways he never anticipated. His revelations have shattered decades of carefully constructed narratives about one of the most famous love stories in royal history. Whether his account changes public perception of Queen Camilla remains to be seen, but his courage in breaking 5 decades of silence ensures that future historians will have a more complete picture of the events that shaped the modern monarchy. Some secrets, Andrew reminds us, are too important to take to the grave. The truth, however painful, deserves to be heard.